All right, so good evening. This is Block 1, Lecture 2, Assessing Christopher Columbus. I'd like to start by explaining to you that, what historiography is. Historiography is kind of how we see the past, how we study history. You can study history lots of different ways. History has a lot of different purposes. Should history be seeking the truth? Should history be seeking to support the civilization that's telling the story? What's the point of history? And that kind of gets into some of the stuff about Christopher Columbus. When I was a kid growing up, it was just sort of starting to change how Christopher Columbus was looked at. But when my parents were growing up, the story of Christopher Columbus was very, very simple. Christopher Columbus was an Italian. He sailed for the King of Spain. He had this great idea that he could get to the east by sailing west. Now, just FYI, so we know this is a common misconception. Everybody in Columbus's time who had any degree of education knew that the world was round. Christopher Columbus did not prove the world was round. Nobody thought the world was flat. Nobody thought that by you could sail to the end of the ocean and then, down you'd fall. Christopher Columbus did not prove. Let me just make sure this is taping. Yes, it's taping. Christopher Columbus did not prove to anybody that the world was round. What Christopher Columbus did was he showed, his theory was that you could get to the Spice Islands of the East India by sailing to the west out across what was then known as the Ocean Sea, what we call the Atlantic Ocean. The facts are not in dispute. He was an Italian from the city of Genoa. He went to sea at the age of 8. He became a very famous captain, a great navigator, and he had this idea that he could get to the east by sailing west. He convinced the King of Spain and his queen to fund a voyage, and fund a voyage they did. Columbus sailed west out into the Ocean Sea, and it's very important to kind of recognize why, people care about this. This was a great unknown. Christopher Columbus, traditional people who take the traditional interpretation say that this was a man seeking, heading off out into the unknown. He knew it was going to be dangerous. He was a pioneer, an explorer, a trail setter, not a trendsetter, but a trailblazer. That's what I was trying to say, a trailblazer. And nobody knew how big the ocean was. Nobody, people didn't like to sail outside of the sight of land. And Columbus did. And his crew almost mutinied. They had been away from land for so long. They said, we're going back tomorrow if we don't find land. And lo and behold, that night, they saw land. And Columbus thought he was in India, or some islands off of the Indian coast. And that's why he called the people that he met there Indians, obviously. Columbus was incredibly lost. In fact, what Columbus's mistake was, Columbus thought the world was a lot smaller than it actually was. Columbus thought the world was about half the size it was. He did not count on having two enormous continents in the way between Europe and Asia by sailing west. He actually ended up making 4 voyages to the New World, all the meanwhile believing that he is somewhere around India, and if he just kept sailing around, he would eventually find the cities and civilization and spices and trading depots and cities of India. And of course he did not find any of those things because he was in a continent that was completely unknown to contemporary European civilization in the late 1400s. Why do we celebrate this guy? Traditionally understood, look, we celebrate this guy enough. We have a day off from school in his honor. Think about the other people that we have days off for. We have a day off for Martin Luther King. I think we could all agree, kind of an American hero, an important guy. We had a day off for George Washington. We had a day off for Abraham Lincoln, which morphed into President's Day sometime around the late 1990s. And Christopher Columbus, a man who never set foot in what would become the United States. Why is this guy the hero? Well, he's the hero because he did something that he was the first person to do something, and people followed him. So many people followed him. Europeans followed him, Frenchmen followed him, Englishmen followed him, Dutch followed him, Spanish, Portuguese, everyone we followed Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus started in motion one of the greatest movements of human beings in all of history. By 300 years after Columbus sailed is the American Revolution. Millions of people have made the trip across the Atlantic Ocean. Millions of them willingly, millions of them unwillingly, in chains from Africa. That Christopher Columbus is important because he changed so much about the world. He set so many things in motion that all of American civilization, all of these wonderful things that we have, the science, the technology, the culture, the democracy, the liberal government, the liberties, the freedom, all of that stuff was set in motion by this man, one man having an idea, convincing other people to support his idea, and heading out west across the unknown ocean into this great, vast unknown. And he's a hero, and he should be celebrated for it. We admire explorers. We admire people who go out into the unknown. He's brave as hell. He has a really good story. And we celebrate him. Now, it's a little interesting why Christopher Columbus, how this started to develop, why we celebrate Christopher Columbus, of all people. When the country was founded, George Washington didn't care one bit about Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus becomes important when you start to get, goes into ethnic politics. Christopher Columbus becomes important when there starts to be a large Italian community in the United States in the mid to late 1800s and early 20th century. There's all of a sudden, excuse me, there's all of a sudden a lot of Italian voters. And Italian voters are electing Italians to office. And the Italians are kind of looking around saying, hey, who do we got to celebrate around here? Hey, how about Christopher Columbus? He's an important guy. So politicians, in order to get votes from Italians, said, hey, we're going to have a Christopher Columbus Day. We're going to have a Christopher Columbus parade. Everyone's going to be off from school. Everybody's going to be off from work. And voila! In order to get the Italian vote, and then when the Italians themselves were running a show in a lot of American cities, they established Christopher Columbus Day to honor their own ethnicity. Makes sense. We like it when our ethnicities are honored. We like when schools are named after people from our particular communities. And the Italians were no different. They got a whole federal day out of it. That's because there's a lot of Italians in important cities in the United States. That's why we celebrate Columbus Day, because of the ethnic vote of the Italian community. And for generations, this was the view of Christopher Columbus. In the late 60s, and then through the 70s and cascading into 1992, which was the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus, a more critical view of Christopher Columbus began to be espoused by people critical of the traditional interpretation. And they started throwing around this genocide. That Christopher Columbus was a genocidal maniac. That Christopher Columbus's arrival is not something to be celebrated. Christopher Columbus's arrival, in fact, led to the destruction of the American Indians. That when Christopher Columbus arrived on that island, Hispaniola, in the West Indies, he took a look at the people and he thought them as a curiosity. He took some of them back to Europe to show off to the king and queen. Some of the people on his ship, they were purposefully brutal to the Indians. Some of them enslaved the Indians. The Indians were enslaved in large numbers. And then due to the fact that Columbus and the other Europeans brought along diseases to which the American Indians had no defenses, that American Indians started dying of disease by the dozens and then hundreds and then thousands and then millions. And if Christopher Columbus had not brought his sorry rear end to the New World, which was not really a new world at all, it was a new world to Columbus, but the people who were here, it was their regular world, or nothing new about it. Columbus brought to the New World nothing but death, destruction, pain, suffering. Not only that, he also was the person who started this whole thing that led to 20 million Africans being shipped across the Atlantic Ocean in chains. What are we celebrating here? The critics argued. A man who led to the destruction of American Indian culture on 2 continents? And we're celebrating a guy whose arrival here set in motion a chain of events which led to the enslavement of millions of Africans. What's to celebrate? Like I said, charges of genocide began being tossed around. People compare Columbus to Hitler. Google this, you'll see it all over the internet. That's the critical view of Christopher Columbus. The traditionalists responded, of course, their guy was being attacked. They said, look, you can't put 20th and 21st century values on a man who lived 500 years previous to that. that we can't judge Christopher Columbus based on 2013 or 1992 standards. You want to judge Christopher Columbus, he needs to be judged according to the standards of his time. Let's judge him against other people in 1492, not people in 2013. And then they further said, look, Christopher Columbus didn't personally enslave anybody. He cannot be held responsible for the actions of his crew personally. And then they say, look, he obviously didn't mean to spread disease. He didn't even know about disease. Disease was a mystery. People had some idea that if you were in the same room as a sick person, you might get it, but no one knew there was little itty-bitty microscopic creatures that were flying around and cough and spit and snot. How can you blame Columbus for this? That if you're going to blame someone, if you're going to charge somebody with genocide, they had better have meant to commit genocide. They say to compare Columbus to Hitler is a false comparison. And then they went on to further say, look, study human history. The study of human history is merely the study of one civilization replacing another, often by conquest. The Romans got rid of the Etruscans, then the Germans came down, got rid of the Romans, they mixed all with them, became Italians. Why are we singling out Christopher Columbus? Why not single out everybody else who spread their own particular culture and their own civilization throughout the history of mankind? Why is it Columbus that gets the charges of genocide against him? And then they also go on to say, the critics of the critics, they say that, look, Indian civilization was great, but isn't what replaced it in the end, as much pain as it might have caused, isn't this better? The health, the wealth, the freedom, the democracy, the liberality of Western civilization, of America, of the Declaration of Independence, wasn't that sort of stuff worth, or was that stuff worth the pain and the suffering and the disease and the awfulness of that collision of cultures? That the story of the world is the collision of cultures, and in this particular case, the culture that valued tolerance and freedom and liberty and democracy won out, and we're all better off for it. And then, of course, the critics would criticize that. They said, hey, look, what's so great about democracy? In America, you have slavery, you have, the destruction of the Indians. What's so great about this democracy? And so you see this